"Stay out of the kitchen. I already ordered pizza." The words sliced through my chest like a serrated knife, leaving jagged wounds that would bleed for months to come. I remember standing there, my 68-year-old hands still dusted with flour from the pie crust I'd been rolling with such care, watching my only daughter Sarah dismiss 40 years of love with the casual cruelty of someone swatting away an annoying fly. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, just please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep finding the courage to speak these truths that have been suffocating me for so long. My name is Merle Hadley, and until 6 months ago, I believed my worth was measured in perfectly risen dinner rolls and the number of times my family said please and thank you for meals I'd spent hours preparing. I lived in a modest 2-story house in Lakewood, California, where the morning sun would stream through my kitchen windows and dance across the granite countertops I'd saved 3 years to afford. The kitchen was my sanctuary, filled with the aroma of vanilla extract and cinnamon, lined with mason jars containing my grandmother's secret spice blends, and decorated with 40 years of family photos showing birthday cakes I'd baked, holiday dinners I'd orchestrated, and countless moments of joy I'd created with these very hands. But that Sunday afternoon in March, standing in my beloved kitchen wearing the lavender apron my late mother had sewn for me decades ago, I felt smaller than the flour particles settling on my trembling fingers. Sarah had walked in with the confident stride of someone who owned the world, her designer purse slung over her shoulder, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon light. She was 34 years old, successful in her marketing career, and had inherited her father's ability to look through people rather than at them. "Mom, stay out of the kitchen," she'd said without even glancing at the apple pie ingredients I'd carefully arranged on the counter. Granny Smith apples I'd hand-selected at the farmer's market, organic cinnamon I'd splurged on because I knew it was her favorite, and the ceramic pie dish that had belonged to my grandmother. I already ordered pizza. The rolling pin slipped from my hands and clattered against the marble surface with a sound that seemed to echo through my entire soul. For 40 years, I had been the heartbeat of this house. I was the woman who remembered everyone's favorite foods, who stayed up until midnight baking birthday cakes shaped like dinosaurs and castles, who never missed a school event or soccer game, who worked double shifts as a high school math teacher to help pay for Sarah's college tuition, while her father claimed his income was already stretched thin by his golf membership and weekend fishing trips. "But sweetheart," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator that was filled with ingredients for the week's meals I'd already planned around her visit. "I thought you loved my apple pie. You used to say it reminded you of home." Sarah finally looked at me then, her brown eyes, the same eyes I'd stared into during countless bedtime stories and tear-filled conversations about playground bullies and teenage heartbreaks, now cold and distant as winter fog. "I just don't need you getting in the way," she said with the dismissive tone she might use with a telemarketer. "Besides, I'm trying to watch my carbs." She turned and walked out of the kitchen, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors with the same rhythm that had once announced her arrival home from school, when she'd burst through the front door with stories about her day and an eagerness to help me stir cookie dough. Now those footsteps sounded like a countdown to my irrelevance. I stood there in the sudden silence, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 family dinners, staring at the half-formed pie crust that would never fulfill its purpose. The afternoon sun continued streaming through the windows, but somehow the light felt dimmer, as if the universe itself had acknowledged that something precious had died in this moment. My hands shook as I gathered the apple slices, each one a small monument to the care I'd thought mattered, and dropped them into the garbage disposal where they disappeared with a grinding sound that seemed to swallow my dignity along with them. That evening, I sat alone at the dining room table where Sarah had eaten thousands of meals I'd prepared, picking at a slice of the pizza she'd ordered, pepperoni and mushroom from a chain restaurant, the kind of processed food I'd spent decades avoiding in favor of fresh, homemade alternatives. The cheese sat heavy in my stomach like a stone, and I found myself remembering the first time I'd taught Sarah to make pie crust, her tiny hands covered in flour as she giggled and accidentally dropped butter on the floor. Where had that little girl gone? When had I become nothing more than an obstacle in her perfectly organized life? The phone rang twice that week. Both times, Sarah called to discuss practical matters. When I planned to transfer the title of the car I'd bought for her 26th birthday, and whether I'd remembered to update my will to ensure her inheritance would avoid unnecessary taxes. She spoke to me like I was her accountant, rather than the woman who'd rocked her to sleep every night for the first 3 years of her life, who'd worked overtime to afford her dance lessons and art supplies, who'd celebrated every achievement as if it were my own personal victory. "Mom, you sound tired," she said during the second call. But her concern felt perfunctory, like a checkbox on her list of daughterly obligations. "Maybe you should consider taking some time for yourself. Travel or something. You've always talked about seeing Europe." What she didn't say, but what I heard in the space between her words, was that she'd be perfectly fine if I disappeared entirely. The house could become her rental property. The savings account could fund her next business venture. And I could become a pleasant memory she'd share at dinner parties about the sweet old mother who'd finally given her the space to live her own life. That night, I lay in the king-sized bed I'd shared with her father for 32 years before cancer took him, staring at the ceiling and feeling more alone than I had even in those first raw months of widowhood. At least then, I'd had purpose. Sarah had needed me to help her navigate the loss, to maintain the family traditions that anchored us both to something larger than our grief. Now I understood that she'd simply been waiting for an appropriate amount of time to pass before she could safely cut me loose without appearing heartless to her friends and colleagues. The house creaked around me with the familiar sounds of settling wood and shifting foundations, but instead of comfort, these noises now felt like warnings. This place that I'd thought of as permanent, as much a part of my identity as my own skin, was just another temporary arrangement that could be dissolved whenever it became inconvenient for the people I'd spent my life serving. I rose at dawn and wandered through rooms filled with photo albums documenting decades of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and family vacations where I'd been the invisible force ensuring everyone else's happiness while my own needs remained carefully unexamined. In every picture, I wore the same expression. A smile that reached my eyes because I genuinely believed that my family's joy was inseparable from my own worth as a human being. The morning after Sarah's casual dismissal, I found myself sitting in my breakfast nook with a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, staring at the checkbook that held the evidence of 40 years of selfless devotion. Each entry told a story of love that had apparently gone unnoticed, sacrifices that had been accepted as entitlements rather than gifts. September 2019, $15,000 to help Sarah with the down payment on her downtown condo. She'd called me crying, explaining how the real estate market was impossible and how she'd never be able to afford anything decent without help. I'd liquidated my retirement fund early, paying penalties I couldn't afford, because I couldn't bear the thought of my daughter struggling when I had the power to help. December 2019, $2,800 for Sarah's European vacation with her friends. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Mom," she'd said, showing me pictures of the Italian villa they wanted to rent. "All my friends are going, and I'll be the only one left out." I'd worked extra tutoring sessions for 3 months, canceling my own doctor's appointments and skipping meals to save money, because her happiness had always been worth more than my comfort. March 2020. $8,500 for Sarah's car repairs after she'd rear-ended someone while texting. The insurance didn't cover everything, and she'd sobbed on my shoulder about how she couldn't afford the deductible. I'd given her the money I'd been saving for the roof repairs that our house desperately needed. For 2 years, I'd placed buckets in the attic during rainstorms, rather than ask her to pay me back. June 2021, $12,000 for Sarah's MBA program when she decided her bachelor's degree wasn't enough. "Think of it as an investment in our family's future," she'd said with that charming smile that had melted my heart since she was 3 years old. I'd taken out a second mortgage on the house, adding years to my debt at an age when I should have been planning for retirement. I flipped through page after page of similar entries. Money for her friend's wedding gift when she was short on cash, funds for the designer furniture that would really make her place feel like home, payments for the expensive gym membership that was essential for her mental health. Each transaction represented days when I'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, so she could dine at restaurants where the appetizers cost more than my weekly grocery budget. But it wasn't just the money. God, if it had only been about money, maybe I could have forgiven myself for being such a fool. I remembered last Thanksgiving, when I'd spent 3 days preparing Sarah's favorite feast. The herb-crusted turkey that required me to get up at 4 a.m. to start the preparations. The sweet potato casserole made from my grandmother's recipe that took hours of hand mashing because Sarah insisted the texture wasn't right when I used the food processor. The cranberry sauce made from scratch because she'd wrinkled her nose at the canned version I'd served the year before. She'd arrived 2 hours late, barely acknowledging the spread I'd laid out like an offering to a goddess who couldn't be bothered to show gratitude. Instead, she'd spent the entire meal on her phone, responding to text messages and scrolling through social media while I asked questions about her work and her friends, desperate for any scrap of connection with the daughter who felt more like a stranger every year. "Mom, could you turn down the music?" she'd said without looking up from her screen. "I'm trying to coordinate with Jake about our weekend plans." I'd turned off the classical playlist I'd chosen specifically because she used to say Vivaldi reminded her of our Sunday morning breakfasts when she was little. The silence that followed felt heavier than the elaborate meal I'd prepared for someone who clearly wished she were anywhere else. When she finally put her phone away, it was only to critique the stuffing. "It tastes different this year. Did you change something?" She'd taken another bite and frowned. "Actually, never mind. I'm pretty full anyway." She'd left before dessert, claiming she had plans that couldn't wait, taking with her the leftover containers I'd prepared because I knew she hated cooking for herself. I'd spent the rest of the evening eating pumpkin pie alone, surrounded by dirty dishes and the echo of her disinterest. The Christmas before that had been even worse. I'd asked her what she wanted, hoping to recapture some of the magic from her childhood when she'd make elaborate wish lists and we'd spend December mornings wrapping presents together. Instead, she'd sent me a link to an expensive handbag with a text message. "This would be perfect. Thanks, Mom. No, please." No acknowledgement that the bag cost more than I spent on myself in 6 months. Just an assumption that my role was to provide whatever she desired without question or hesitation. I'd bought the bag, of course, along with the matching wallet and the designer shoes she'd casually mentioned in a follow-up text. On Christmas morning, she'd opened each gift with the enthusiasm of someone checking items off a shopping list, snapping a few photos for her Instagram story before setting them aside to answer a phone call that was apparently more important than the woman who'd given birth to her. My own gift from Sarah that year had been a generic spa gift card, the kind you could pick up at any grocery store checkout line. The amount was exactly $50, I noticed, probably the minimum required to avoid looking completely thoughtless. She hadn't even removed the price tag. But perhaps the most devastating memory was from my 65th birthday last year. I'd planned a small dinner party, inviting the few friends I had left after years of canceling social plans whenever Sarah needed something. I'd spent weeks preparing, cleaning the house until it sparkled, arranging flowers from my garden, and cooking all of Sarah's favorite dishes even though the party was supposed to be for me. Sarah had promised to come early to help set up. Instead, she'd called an hour before the guests were due to arrive. "Mom, I'm so sorry, but something came up at work. You know how it is." Rain check? I'd stood in my kitchen, surrounded by enough food for 10 people, wearing the new dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and felt my heart crack like an egg against concrete. My friends had rallied around me, staying late and helping me package leftovers, but their pity had been almost worse than Sarah's absence. "Honey," my neighbor Linda had said gently, "when was the last time Sarah did something for your birthday that didn't involve her convenience?" I'd defended her, of course, made excuses about her demanding career and busy social life, insisted that she was just going through a selfish phase that she'd outgrow. But Linda's question had planted a seed of doubt that had been growing in the darkness of my denial for months. The pattern was always the same. Sarah needed something. I provided it. Sarah wanted something. I made it happen. Sarah had a crisis. I dropped everything to solve it. But when I needed support, during my bout with pneumonia 2 winters ago, during the anniversary of her father's death when grief hit me like a tsunami, during the long nights when loneliness felt like a physical ache in my chest, Sarah was always too busy, too stressed, too important to spare more than a perfunctory phone call. "You're so strong, Mom," she'd say, when I tried to express my struggles. "You always figure everything out. I really admire how independent you are. Independent. The word she used when she wanted to make abandonment sound like a compliment. I closed the checkbook and walked to my bedroom, where I kept a shoebox filled with every card and letter Sarah had given me over the years. I pulled out her high school graduation card, written in her careful teenage handwriting. Thank you for being the best mom in the world. I could never repay everything you've done for me. I love you so much. Had she meant it then? Or had I always been nothing more than a convenient resource? Someone whose love was so guaranteed that it required no maintenance or reciprocation. I thought about her father, how he'd worked long hours but always made time for family dinners, always asked about my day with genuine interest, always treated me like a partner rather than a service provider. If he could see how his daughter had learned to take my love for granted, would he be proud of the woman she'd become? The question that tormented me most was whether I'd created this monster through my own endless giving. Had I taught her that my needs didn't matter by never voicing them? Had I shown her that love meant sacrifice by sacrificing everything while expecting nothing in return? Was I used? The thought whispered through my mind like poison, seeping into every memory and recoloring it with the sickening possibility that my entire relationship with my daughter had been built on exploitation disguised as family obligation. I picked up my phone and scrolled through our recent text messages. Her communications read like demands sent to a personal assistant. Need $500 for car registration. Can you pick up my dry cleaning? Transfer money for rent. Handle the insurance thing. Not once in the past 6 months had she asked how I was feeling, what I was doing for myself, or whether I needed anything. Not once had she offered to help with anything that didn't directly benefit her. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine, something I rarely allowed myself because Sarah had once commented that drinking alone was concerning, and tried to remember the last time my daughter had made me feel loved rather than used. The silence stretched on until the wine was gone and the answer remained elusive, buried beneath decades of one-sided devotion that I'd mistaken for a loving relationship. Outside my window, I could see the neighbor's family gathered around their dining room table, talking and laughing over what looked like a simple weeknight dinner. The teenage daughter was helping clear dishes while the parents smiled at something she'd said. The scene looked so natural, so effortless, so different from the careful choreography of guilt and obligation that had defined my relationship with Sarah for years. I realized I couldn't remember the last time Sarah and I had shared a genuine laugh, the last time she'd hugged me without wanting something, the last time she'd seemed genuinely happy to see me rather than resigned to enduring my company. The truth settled in my stomach like a lead weight. I had been used, for decades, by the person I loved most in the world. The realization that I'd been used hit me like a slow-acting poison, seeping through my bloodstream and contaminating every interaction I'd had with Sarah over the past decade. But it was the small cruelties, the everyday dismissals, the microaggressions disguised as casual conversation that truly began to suffocate me in the days following her kitchen dismissal. 3 days after the pie incident, Sarah called during my afternoon tea, the one ritual I'd maintained from my childhood. A quiet moment with chamomile and honey that my mother had taught me was sacred time for reflection. The phone's shrill ring shattered the peaceful silence of my sunlit breakfast nook. "Mom, I need you to call the insurance company about Dad's old policy," Sarah said without preamble, no greeting, no inquiry about my well-being. Her voice carried the brisk efficiency of someone delegating tasks to an employee. "They're being difficult about the beneficiary forms. And you know how to handle these people better than I do." I set down my delicate china teacup, part of the wedding set that had belonged to my grandmother, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "These people," she'd said, as if the insurance representatives were beneath her, as if dealing with them was work suitable only for someone of my lower station in life. "Sarah, sweetheart, I'm having my tea right now. Could I call you back in?" "Mom, this is important. I don't have time to wait around. I have a conference call in 20 minutes, and I need this handled today." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling smaller than the tea leaves settling at the bottom of my cup. When had my time become so worthless that it could be interrupted without apology? When had my daily routines become obstacles to her convenience rather than legitimate claims on my own life? I spent the next hour on hold with the insurance company, listening to tinny classical music while my tea grew cold and the afternoon light shifted away from my favorite reading chair. When I finally reached a representative and resolved Sarah's issue, a simple matter that required nothing more than my signature on a form, I felt hollowed out, as if something vital had been scooped from my core and discarded. Sarah never called back to thank me or even confirm that the problem had been solved. The following week brought a text message that arrived during my book club meeting, the one social activity I'd managed to maintain despite years of Sarah's emergencies. "Mom, can you swing by my place and wait for the cable guy? I have a work thing and can't reschedule." I looked around the circle of women discussing the month's novel, their faces animated with intellectual engagement, and felt the familiar tug of obligation. These women were my age, my peers, people who treated me as an equal rather than a convenient resource. But Sarah needed me, and despite everything, I still couldn't bear the thought of disappointing her. "I'm sorry, ladies," I said, gathering my things while shame burned in my cheeks. "Family emergency." The concerned murmurs that followed me out the door only deepened my humiliation. How many times had I used those words, family emergency, to excuse Sarah's casual disregard for my commitments? How many friendships had I allowed to wither because I was always available to solve her problems, but never available to nurture my own relationships? I spent 3 hours in Sarah's sterile condo, waiting for a technician who never showed up. The apartment felt like a museum of my own generosity. The expensive coffee table I'd helped her buy, the artwork I'd gifted her for Christmas, the kitchen appliances she'd borrowed and never returned. But there were no photos of us together. No evidence that I existed in her life beyond my utility as a problem solver and ATM. When Sarah finally came home, she barely acknowledged my presence. "Oh, they didn't come." Typical. Well, thanks for trying, I guess. She was already scrolling through her phone, probably arranging dinner plans that didn't include the mother who'd wasted her entire afternoon for nothing. The drive home took me through the neighborhood where I'd raised her, past the park where I'd pushed her on swings for hours, past the elementary school where I'd volunteered in her classroom every Friday for 6 years. Each landmark felt like a monument to my own foolishness, evidence of how thoroughly I'd invested in someone who now treated me like hired help. But it was my birthday that finally cracked open the last reservoir of hope I'd been carrying. I turned 68 on a Tuesday in April, and for the first time in decades, I decided not to plan my own celebration. Surely Sarah would remember. Surely the daughter I'd given everything to would mark the day that brought me into the world, the day that had ultimately made her existence possible. I woke that morning with nervous excitement, the kind of anticipation I hadn't felt since childhood Christmas mornings. I put on my favorite dress, the blue one that brought out my eyes, and spent extra time on my makeup, wanting to look my best for whatever surprise Sarah might have planned. The day stretched ahead like an empty canvas. I checked my phone every few minutes, waiting for the call that would summon me to lunch at my favorite restaurant, or invite me to join her for a movie we could watch together. I imagined her arriving at my door with flowers, or perhaps a small gift that showed she'd been thinking of me. Noon came and went. Then 1 o'clock. Then 2. At 3:30 my phone finally rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and my heart leaped with relief and joy. "Mom, I'm having the worst day. My presentation got completely torn apart in the meeting, and now I have to redo everything by tomorrow. I'm totally overwhelmed." I waited for the birthday acknowledgement, for some recognition that this day held significance beyond her professional struggles. "Can you pick up dinner for me? I don't have time to leave the office, but I'm starving, and there's nothing good in the building. Maybe that Thai place you like? Just leave it with the security guard downstairs." The silence stretched between us while I processed what was happening. She wanted me to fetch her dinner, on my birthday, without even acknowledging what day it was. "Sarah," I said carefully, my voice barely above a whisper, "do you know what today is?" A pause. The sound of papers shuffling. "Tuesday?" The word hit me like a physical blow. Tuesday. Not your birthday. Not the day my amazing mother was born. Just Tuesday. A generic day of the week that held no more significance than any other in her self-centered universe. "It's my birthday, sweetheart." Another pause. Longer this time. Oh God, Mom. I'm so sorry. I'm just so stressed with this work thing. Can we celebrate this weekend? I promise I'll make it up to you." But her voice carried no real remorse, just the mild irritation of someone who'd been caught in a social oversight. This weekend. Another promise that would be broken when something more important, which was everything, demanded her attention. So, about that Thai food. I hung up without answering and sat in my silent house, still wearing my birthday dress, still hoping for a miracle that would transform this day into something bearable. The afternoon shadows grew longer across my living room floor, marking the passage of hours that my own daughter had deemed insignificant. At 6 o'clock, my neighbor Linda knocked on my door with a small chocolate cake and a bottle of wine. "Happy birthday, honey," she said, her eyes soft with understanding. "I thought you might like some company." We ate cake in my kitchen while Linda shared stories about her grandchildren's latest adventures. She asked about my day, listened to my answers, treated my words as if they mattered. For 2 hours, I remembered what it felt like to be valued, to be seen as more than a convenience store that never closed. After Linda left, I sat alone with the remaining cake and tried to remember when Sarah had stopped seeing me as a person worthy of consideration. Had it been gradual, or had there been a specific moment when I'd crossed from beloved mother to useful resource? Had I been complicit in my own dehumanization by accepting each small indignity without protest? I thought about the last time Sarah had asked about my feelings, my dreams, my fears. I couldn't remember. Our conversations had been reduced to logistics, what she needed, when she needed it, how I could make her life easier. I'd become a supporting character in her story, and she'd never bothered to wonder whether I had a story of my own. The next morning, I made a decision that terrified me. I was going to say no. When Sarah called 2 days later asking me to babysit her friend's children so they could attend a work function, I took a deep breath and spoke words that felt foreign in my mouth. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I have plans that evening." The silence on the other end was deafening. "Plans? What kind of plans?" The question was loaded with disbelief, as if the idea that I might have a life independent of her needs was absurd, as if my existence outside of her convenience was an impossibility she'd never considered. "Just plans," I repeated, my hands shaking with the audacity of claiming my own time. "Mom, this is really important. Julie's been so stressed, and this event could be huge for her career. You can reschedule whatever you're doing, right?" The assumption in her voice, that my life was infinitely flexible while hers was carved in stone, made my stomach twist with anger I'd never allowed myself to feel before. "No, Sarah, I can't reschedule." Another pause. "Fine. I guess I'll figure something else out. Thanks for nothing." The line went dead, and I sat staring at my phone, trembling with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I'd said no. For the first time in my adult relationship with my daughter, I had prioritized my own needs over her demands, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that this small act of self-preservation would probably result in days or weeks of silent treatment, punishment for daring to value myself enough to maintain boundaries. I walked to my bathroom mirror and stared at the woman looking back at me. 68 years old, hair more gray than brown, lines around my eyes from decades of worry about other people's happiness. When had I become so invisible that even I had stopped seeing myself? The woman in the mirror looked tired, defeated, used up, but for the first time in years, she also looked like she might be ready to fight back. The silent treatment began exactly 12 hours after I dared to say no to Sarah. It started with the absence of her usual demanding text messages, then stretched into days without any contact at all. At first, I felt relief, blessed quiet from the constant stream of requests and obligations, but as the silence deepened, a familiar panic began clawing at my chest. What if she never spoke to me again? What if my one moment of backbone had cost me the only family I had left? By the 4th day, I was checking my phone obsessively, crafting and deleting apology texts, inventing emergencies that might force her to call me. The rational part of my mind knew this was manipulation, but the terrified mother in me whispered that maybe I'd been too harsh, too selfish, too demanding of basic respect. Then, on Friday morning, my phone erupted with a flurry of messages that made my hands shake as I read them. "Mom, I can't believe how selfish you've become. Julie had to miss the most important networking event of her career because you couldn't be bothered to help for one evening. I've been thinking about our conversation, and honestly, I'm worried about you. This isn't like you at all. Maybe you should see someone about this attitude problem. Dad would be so disappointed to see how you're treating his daughter. He always said family comes first, but apparently you've forgotten what that means." The last message hit me like a physical blow. Bringing her father into this, weaponizing his memory against me, felt like the cruelest cut of all. Richard had indeed believed in family loyalty, but he'd also believed in mutual respect, in treating the people you loved with kindness rather than taking them for granted. My hands trembled as I typed and retyped responses, each one weaker than the last. Part of me wanted to capitulate immediately, to apologize for daring to have needs of my own, to beg forgiveness for the sin of valuing myself enough to maintain a simple boundary, but another part of me, a small, stubborn voice that sounded remarkably like my mother, whispered that healthy relationships didn't require one person to disappear completely so the other could thrive. Before I could lose my nerve, I called my old friend Linda, the same neighbor who'd brought me birthday cake and actually remembered that I existed as a human being rather than a service provider. "Linda," I said when she answered, my voice cracking with the weight of everything I'd been carrying alone. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course, honey. What's wrong?" I took a shuddering breath and asked the question that had been torturing me for weeks. "Do you think I'm a bad mother?" The silence on the other end stretched just long enough to send my anxiety spiraling, but when Linda finally spoke, her voice was firm and clear. "Merle Hadley, you are asking the wrong question entirely. The question isn't whether you're a bad mother. The question is whether Sarah is a good daughter." The words hit me like a revelation, flipping my entire perspective upside down. For decades, I'd measured my worth by Sarah's happiness, assuming that any conflict between us must be evidence of my failure as a parent. It had never occurred to me to evaluate her behavior, to hold her accountable for her treatment of me. But Linda, she's right about one thing. This isn't like me. I've never refused to help her before, never put my own needs first. Maybe I am changing in ways that aren't healthy. Linda's laugh was sharp and knowing. "Oh, honey, you want to know what's unhealthy? Spending 40 years training someone to treat you like a doormat and then feeling guilty when you finally stand up. You want to know what's unhealthy? Having a daughter who throws tantrums when her personal servant develops a backbone." Personal servant. The phrase made me flinch because it was so accurate, so brutally honest about what my relationship with Sarah had become. "She says her father would be disappointed in me," I whispered, the words scraping my throat raw. "Richard would be disappointed, all right," Linda said fiercely. "He'd be disappointed that his daughter learned to exploit the woman he loved. He'd be disappointed that she turned his wife into a shadow of herself. And he'd be proud as hell that you're finally fighting back." That afternoon, Linda insisted on taking me to lunch at a little cafe downtown, the kind of place where older women could sit and talk without feeling rushed or judged. Over chicken salad sandwiches and iced tea, she told me stories about her own daughter's transition from grateful child to entitled adult, about the difficult process of renegotiating relationships when children forgot that parents were people too. "The hardest part," Linda said, stirring honey into her tea with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned to savor small pleasures, "is accepting that you might lose them in order to save yourself. But honey, what you have with Sarah right now isn't a relationship worth saving. It's an arrangement that's slowly killing you." As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with another message from Sarah. "Mom, I really think you need to talk to someone. This behavior is concerning, and I'm worried about your mental health. I found the name of a therapist who specializes in older adults going through difficult transitions." I showed the message to Linda, who read it with an expression of growing disgust. "She's trying to make you think you're crazy for wanting basic respect," Linda said flatly. "Classic manipulation. When they can't guilt you back into compliance, they attack your sanity." But before I could spiral into fresh doubt, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. "Grandma Merle? It's Emma." My heart stopped. Emma was Sarah's college roommate's daughter, a sweet 22-year-old who'd started calling me Grandma Merle during visits to our house when she was little. I hadn't heard from her in months, not since Sarah had gradually phased out relationships that didn't serve her immediate purposes. "Emma, sweetheart, how are you?" "I'm okay, but I wanted to call because I heard about what happened between you and Sarah, and I thought you should know something." My stomach clenched. "What did you hear?" "She's been telling everyone that you're having some kind of breakdown, that you're becoming difficult and demanding. She's painting herself as this long-suffering daughter dealing with an unstable mother." The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. Sarah wasn't just punishing me privately. She was destroying my reputation, turning our conflict into a narrative where I was the villain and she was the victim. "But Grandma Merle," Emma continued, her young voice strong with conviction, "I wanted you to know that some of us see right through it. My mom and I have been talking about how Sarah treats you, and we think you're amazing for finally standing up for yourself." Tears sprang to my eyes. Here was validation from an unexpected source. Someone who'd witnessed our family dynamics from the outside and recognized the truth I'd been too close to see. "I've watched you for years," Emma went on, "and you're the most generous, loving person I know. The way you used to light up when Sarah came to visit, the way you'd spend days preparing her favorite foods, the way you'd drop everything to help her with anything she needed. And I've watched her take it all for granted, treat you like you were just there to serve her. Emma, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. Because someone needs to tell you that you deserve better. Someone needs to tell you that saying no doesn't make you a bad mother. It makes you a human being with worth." After Emma hung up, I sat in my car outside the cafe and cried. Not the desperate, choking sobs I'd been suppressing for weeks, but cleansing tears that felt like relief. Someone outside my situation could see what I'd been living through. Someone young enough to be my granddaughter understood that my decades of sacrifice deserved acknowledgement rather than exploitation. That evening, Sarah's campaign of emotional manipulation reached new heights. She called while I was making dinner, her voice dripping with false concern. "Mom, Emma called me today. She said she talked to you, and now I'm even more worried. You're involving other people in our private family business, which really isn't like you. I think you need to consider that your judgment might be compromised right now." The gaslighting was so blatant, so cruel, that I felt something snap inside me. This was my daughter, the baby I'd nursed through fevers and nightmares, the child I'd cheered through school plays and soccer games, the young woman I'd supported through heartbreaks and career changes. And she was trying to convince me that my own perception of reality was faulty because I'd dared to want better treatment. "Sarah," I said, my voice steadier than I'd felt in months, "I need you to stop." "Stop what? Caring about you? Trying to help? Stop trying to make me think I'm crazy for wanting respect. Stop pretending that your concern is genuine when what you really want is for me to go back to being your personal assistant. Stop using your father's memory as a weapon against me." The silence on the other end was deafening. When Sarah finally spoke, her mask of false concern had slipped completely. "I don't know what's gotten into you, but this conversation is over. When you're ready to act like my mother again instead of some selfish stranger, you can call me." She hung up, and I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, waiting for the familiar crush of guilt and panic to overwhelm me. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time in decades, I'd chosen myself over my daughter's manipulation. I'd refused to accept responsibility for her emotional regulation. I'd declined to apologize for having needs of my own. It was terrifying and liberating, and absolutely necessary. That night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw something different. The woman staring back at me still looked tired, still bore the lines of decades spent worrying about other people's happiness. But her eyes held something new: determination. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my life. Tonight, I would sleep without the weight of someone else's expectations crushing my chest. For 68 years, I'd been everyone's caretaker, supporter, and cheerleader. It was time to discover who I could be when I was simply my own. The morning after my phone call with Sarah, I woke before dawn with a sensation I hadn't experienced in decades: the complete absence of obligation. No urgent text messages demanding my immediate attention. No guilt gnawing at my stomach about tasks I should be performing for someone else. No mental checklist of ways I needed to make myself useful to earn my place in my daughter's life. For the first time in 40 years, I belonged entirely to myself. I lay in bed watching the sunrise paint my bedroom walls gold and pink, listening to the birds outside my window singing songs I'd been too distracted to notice before. The silence felt sacred, pregnant with possibility rather than heavy with loneliness. This was what peace felt like. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of choice. At 7:30, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Instead of immediately checking my phone for Sarah's inevitable attempts to restore our toxic dynamic, I turned it off completely and placed it in the kitchen drawer next to the takeout menus I never used, because I'd always been too busy cooking for other people to consider what I might want to eat. Then I did something revolutionary. I made breakfast for one person, prepared exactly the way I liked it, without considering anyone else's preferences or dietary restrictions. Scrambled eggs with fresh chives from my garden. Toast made from the artisanal bread I'd always considered too expensive when I was budgeting around Sarah's endless financial needs. Coffee brewed strong and black, the way I'd always preferred it before I'd learned to accommodate Richard's preference for cream and Sarah's insistence that caffeine after 9 a.m. would keep her awake. I ate slowly, tasting each bite, marveling at how different food could be when you were truly present for the experience, rather than mechanically fueling yourself between crises. The eggs were perfectly creamy. The bread had a complex, nutty flavor that bloomed on my tongue. The coffee was rich and bold, awakening senses I'd forgotten I possessed. After breakfast, I walked through my house with new eyes, seeing it not as Sarah's eventual inheritance, but as my own living space that could be arranged to please me rather than impress visitors who rarely came. The formal dining room that I'd maintained in magazine-perfect condition for holiday gatherings that had become increasingly joyless could be converted into an art studio. The guest bedroom that Sarah used twice a year as a free hotel could become my reading room, filled with comfortable chairs and good lighting instead of the impersonal furniture I'd chosen to avoid making her feel unwelcome. My house, my choices, my life. At 10 o'clock, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I called in sick to my volunteer position at the community center, not because I was physically ill, but because I needed time to remember who I was when I wasn't performing service for others. The lie felt uncomfortable on my tongue, but not as uncomfortable as the years I'd spent abandoning my own needs to fulfill everyone else's expectations. Instead of spending my Tuesday morning teaching literacy to adults who often failed to show up, I drove to the art supply store downtown and bought materials I'd been denying myself for years. Watercolor paints in tubes that felt luxurious and heavy in my hands, brushes with soft bristles that promised smooth, controlled strokes, paper with texture that invited experimentation, a small easel that could sit on my kitchen table and transform any ordinary moment into creative possibility. The teenage cashier smiled as she rang up my purchases, commenting on what a beautiful day it was for starting a new hobby. I wanted to tell her this wasn't a new hobby, but a resurrection, that I'd painted prolifically in college before marriage, and motherhood had redirected all my creative energy toward making other people's lives more beautiful. Instead, I simply smiled back and felt the weight of unused potential settling comfortably in my chest. Driving home, I took a detour through the neighborhood where I'd raised Sarah, past the house where we'd lived when she was small, and I'd still believed that perfect motherhood would guarantee perfect love in return. The new owners had painted it yellow instead of the conservative beige Richard had insisted would maintain property values. They'd planted wildflowers in the front yard, where I'd maintained precise rows of impatiens that required daily watering and constant attention. The house looked happier, more alive, more authentically itself. I wondered if I could achieve the same transformation. That afternoon, I set up my easel in the sunroom and attempted to paint the view from my window, the maple tree that Richard had wanted to remove because it dropped leaves on his car, the uneven stone path I'd always meant to repair, the neighbor's fence that could have been straighter, but somehow looked charming in its imperfection. My hands felt clumsy at first, uncertain about color mixing and brush control. The painting that emerged was amateur and unpolished, nothing like the skilled work I'd produced in my 20s. But it was mine, created purely for the joy of creation, without needing to serve anyone else's purposes or meet anyone else's standards. As I painted, I found myself thinking about Emma's phone call, about her observation that I'd always lit up when Sarah visited. When had that stopped being true? When had my daughter's presence begun to feel like a performance I needed to deliver rather than a gift I was receiving? The answer came with painful clarity. It had been gradual, so slow I hadn't noticed the erosion until the foundation had completely crumbled. Each time I'd swallowed my hurt rather than expressing it. Each time I'd accepted disrespect to avoid conflict. Each time I'd prioritized keeping peace over maintaining dignity. I'd taught her that my feelings were negotiable while hers were sacred. I'd been complicit in my own diminishment, and that realization stung worse than any of Sarah's specific cruelties. But I was also responsible for changing the pattern, and that knowledge felt empowering rather than overwhelming. At 4 o'clock, I did something that would have been impossible when my phone was constantly buzzing with Sarah's demands. I took a nap, not because I was exhausted from catering to someone else's crisis, but simply because the afternoon sun was warm on my face and my body felt relaxed enough to rest without anxiety about what emergency might require my immediate attention. I slept deeply and dreamlessly for 2 hours, waking to golden light and the sound of children playing in the neighborhood, their laughter floating through my windows like music I'd forgotten how to hear. When I finally turned my phone back on that evening, I found 17 missed calls and 32 text messages from Sarah. My stomach clenched with the familiar panic response, but I forced myself to read through them slowly, analytically, as if I were studying someone else's family dysfunction rather than living inside it. The messages followed a predictable pattern: confusion giving way to anger, anger escalating to threats, threats dissolving into manipulation, and finally, a return to false concern about my mental health. She'd cycled through every tool in her emotional arsenal, desperately trying to find the combination that would restore her access to my resources and compliance. "Mom, where are you? I need to discuss the insurance thing." "Hello? Why aren't you answering your phone? This is getting ridiculous. Call me back immediately. I'm starting to think you're having some kind of breakdown. Should I call someone to check on you? Fine. If you want to act like a child, I'll treat you like one. Don't come crying to me when you realize how stupid you're being. I'm really worried now. You've never ignored me like this before. I'm thinking about calling the police for a wellness check." The threat to involve law enforcement was new, a escalation that revealed how desperate she'd become to regain control. The old me would have called back immediately, apologizing profusely for causing worry, offering explanations and reassurances that would inevitably lead to new demands and obligations. The new me, this woman who'd spent a day painting and napping and eating what she wanted when she wanted it, felt something different: pity, not for herself, but for Sarah. How exhausting it must be to live in a world where other people's autonomy felt like personal attack. How lonely it must be to relate to others only through what they could provide rather than who they were. I scrolled to the bottom of her messages and typed a single response: "I'm fine. I needed some time to think. I'll call you when I'm ready." Then I turned the phone off again and returned to my painting, adding shadows that gave depth to the maple tree, highlights that made the stones seem to glow with their own inner light. For dinner, I opened a bottle of wine that I'd been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to arrive when you were living your life in service to other people's schedules. I paired it with cheese and crackers, eating in my sunroom surrounded by the smell of paint and turpentine, watching the last light fade from the sky while classical music played softly in the background. This was what contentment felt like. Small pleasures chosen freely, silence without anxiety, solitude without loneliness. That night, I lay in bed planning the next day's activities not around someone else's needs, but around my own curiosities and desires. I would visit the library and check out books I'd been wanting to read for years but had never found time for. I would drive to the farmer's market and buy vegetables based on what looked beautiful rather than what was practical. I would call old friends I'd lost touch with while managing Sarah's endless crises, and see if any of them might be interested in rekindling connections I'd allowed to wither. For the first time in decades, tomorrow belonged to me. The woman who'd been told to stay out of her own kitchen was learning that she could create an entire life outside of other people's approval. The discovery was intoxicating and terrifying and absolutely necessary. I was 68 years old, and I was finally ready to find out who I could become when I stopped trying to be who everyone else needed me to be. 3 days into my newfound freedom, Sarah forced the confrontation I'd been both dreading and anticipating. She arrived at my house unannounced on Friday morning, her key turning in my lock with the presumptuous authority of someone who'd never been told she couldn't have unlimited access to my space and time. I was in my sunroom, adding final touches to my third watercolor painting, a study of the garden where I'd spent so many years growing vegetables for family dinners that had become increasingly strained and joyless. The morning light was perfect, casting shadows that gave dimension to the tomato plants I'd painted from memory, and I was completely absorbed in mixing just the right shade of green when I heard her heels clicking across my hardwood floors. "Mom? Where are you? We need to talk." Her voice carried the brittle edge of someone who'd been thwarted and was prepared to escalate until she got what she wanted. This was Sarah in full executive mode, the tone she probably used with subordinates who'd disappointed her with their failure to anticipate her needs. I set down my brush carefully, allowing myself a moment to appreciate the peace I was about to sacrifice. Then walked to the living room where my daughter stood surveying my space with the critical eye of someone evaluating property she intended to inherit. She looked immaculate, as always, her blonde hair styled in the sleek bob that required monthly salon visits costing more than my grocery budget. Her navy suit tailored to perfection, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was armor in the corporate world she'd chosen over meaningful relationships. But beneath the polished exterior, I could see the cracks. Her jawline was tight with barely contained anger. Her hands gripped her designer purse like a weapon. Her eyes held the dangerous glitter of someone who'd been denied their expected privileges and was prepared to fight dirty to reclaim them. "Sarah," I said calmly, staying in the doorway rather than moving closer. "You should have called first." "Called first?" She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Since when do I need to call before visiting my own mother? Since when do you ignore my messages for days at a time? Since when do you turn off your phone like some teenager having a tantrum?" Her questions came rapid fire, each one designed to put me on the defensive, to make me explain and justify my behavior, until I forgot that I was the one who'd been wronged in this relationship. The old me would have immediately begun apologizing, offering explanations that would inevitably sound weak and selfish when filtered through her interpretation. The new me, the woman who'd spent 3 days remembering what it felt like to live without constant anxiety about someone else's approval, simply looked at her and waited. "Well?" Sarah demanded when my silence stretched beyond her comfort zone. "Are you going to explain what's gotten into you? Because I have to tell you, Mom, this whole act is getting really concerning. I've been talking to my therapist about your behavior, and she thinks—" "Stop." The word came out of my mouth with surprising firmness, cutting through her monologue like a blade through silk. "Just stop talking for a minute and listen." Sarah's eyes widened with shock. I don't think I'd ever interrupted her before, never claimed conversational space that she hadn't explicitly granted me. "I need you to sit down," I continued, gesturing toward the couch where she'd lounged countless times while outlining her latest financial needs or relationship dramas that required my emotional labor to resolve. "Because we're going to have a conversation we should have had years ago." "Mom, I don't have time for—" "You'll make time," I said. And something in my voice must have conveyed that this wasn't negotiable because she actually sat down, though her posture remained defensive and impatient. I took the chair across from her, the one that had been Richard's favorite, where he used to read the newspaper on Sunday mornings while I made elaborate breakfasts for a family that had gradually stopped appreciating the effort such meals required. For a moment, I simply looked at my daughter, really looked at her, trying to find traces of the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared her, who used to beg me to read just one more bedtime story, who used to tell me I was the best mommy in the whole world with the fierce conviction that only children possess. That little girl was gone, replaced by this polished stranger who saw me as an obstacle to her convenience, rather than the woman who'd sacrificed decades of her own dreams to ensure Sarah's happiness and success. "When you were 5 years old," I began quietly, "you came home from kindergarten crying because another little girl had said mean things about the lunch I'd packed for you. Do you remember what I did?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this trip down memory lane. Mom, I don't see what— I spent that entire evening making you a lunch that looked like a work of art. Heart-shaped sandwiches, apple slices arranged like flowers, a note telling you how special you were. I stayed up until midnight because I couldn't bear the thought of you feeling embarrassed or unloved. I paused, watching recognition flicker in her eyes, then continued. When you were 16 and your boyfriend broke up with you the week before prom, I drove to 3 different dress shops until I found the perfect gown, then spent my grocery money on shoes to match because I wanted you to feel beautiful enough to walk into that dance with your head held high. I remember that, Sarah said softly, and for a moment her defensive armor slipped enough to reveal something vulnerable underneath. When you graduated college, I took out a loan I couldn't afford to throw you a party worthy of your accomplishments. When you started your career, I helped with your apartment deposit, your professional wardrobe, your car payments, anything that would give you the best possible start in life. My voice remained steady, but I could feel tears building behind my eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition for the decades of love I'd poured into someone who'd learned to see it as her due rather than her good fortune. I did all of that because I loved you more than my own life, I continued. Because your happiness was my happiness. Your success was my success. Your dreams were more important to me than my own. But somewhere along the way, Sarah, you stopped seeing my love as a gift and started seeing it as a service you were entitled to receive. That's not— She started to protest, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. For the past 10 years, you've treated me like an employee whose job was to make your life easier. You've called me when you needed something and ignored me when you didn't. You've accepted my money, my time, my emotional labor, and my unconditional support without ever asking what I might need in return. Sarah's face was flushing red, anger and embarrassment warring in her expression. I never asked you to do those things. You chose to help me because that's what mothers do. You're absolutely right, I said, and my agreement seemed to catch her off guard. I chose to help you. I chose to prioritize your needs over my own. I chose to teach you that my worth was measured by my usefulness to you. And now I'm choosing something different. I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece where I kept a small wooden box that had belonged to my mother. Inside were the keys to Sarah's car, the one I'd co-signed for when her credit wasn't good enough to qualify on her own, the one whose insurance I'd been paying for 3 years because she claimed she was temporarily tight on money. I set the keys on the coffee table between us with a soft clicking sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly charged atmosphere. What are you doing? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm removing myself from your financial support system, I said calmly. Effective immediately. The car payment, the insurance, the credit card I gave you for emergencies, all of it stops today. Sarah shot to her feet, her composure finally cracking completely. You can't do that. I depend on that help. My budget is built around— Your budget will have to change. Just like mine did when I spent my retirement savings ensuring you'd never have to struggle the way I did when I was your age. This is insane. Sarah was pacing now, her heels stabbing into my carpet with each agitated step. You're my mother. You're supposed to support me. I supported you for 34 years, I replied evenly. I gave you the best education I could afford, the most stable home environment possible, and enough financial assistance to launch a successful career. But support is supposed to be temporary scaffolding, not a permanent crutch. I walked to the desk where I kept my important papers and pulled out the folder containing my will, the document Sarah had referenced so casually in our recent conversations, as if my death was just another financial planning opportunity. I'm also making some changes to my estate planning, I said, setting the folder next to the car keys. This house, my savings, my investments— I'm exploring some charitable giving options that align with my values. The blood drained from Sarah's face. You're cutting me out of your will? Because I didn't want you cooking dinner one time? This isn't about the dinner, Sarah. This is about 40 years of taking my love for granted. This is about treating me like a convenience store that never closes. This is about forgetting that I'm a human being with feelings and needs and dreams of my own. For a moment, something flickered across her face that might have been remorse or recognition, but it passed quickly, replaced by the cold calculation I'd learned to recognize as her default mode when she wasn't getting what she wanted. Fine, she said, her voice sharp with fury. "If this is how you want to play it, then don't expect me to come running when you're old and sick and need someone to take care of you. Don't expect me to visit you in whatever nursing home you end up in. Don't expect me to plan your funeral or grieve when you're gone." The threats hung in the air between us like smoke, designed to terrify me back into compliance, to remind me that I needed her more than she needed me. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: clarity. "Sarah," I said softly, "if the only way to keep you in my life is to buy your affection with money and servitude, then I don't actually have you in my life at all. I have a financial arrangement with someone who happens to share my DNA." She stood frozen for a moment, perhaps realizing that her usual tactics weren't working, that the mother she'd trained to absorb her cruelty and respond with increased devotion had somehow transformed into someone with boundaries and self-respect. "I'm going to give you some time to think about what kind of relationship you actually want with me," I continued. "Not what you can get from me, but what you're willing to give. When you're ready to treat me like a person whose feelings matter as much as yours do, you know how to reach me." Sarah grabbed her purse and stalked toward the door, then turned back with one final attempt at manipulation. "Dad would be ashamed of you. He'd be disgusted by how selfish you've become." I looked at her steadily, feeling the weight of her father's memory settling around me like a protective cloak. "Your father loved me enough to want me to be happy. He respected me enough to value my opinions. He treated me like a partner, not a servant. If he were here, he'd be proud that I finally found the courage to demand the same from his daughter." The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, and then she was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her expensive perfume and the echo of 40 years' worth of accumulated resentment, finally finding its voice. I sat in the sudden silence, waiting for the familiar panic to overwhelm me, for the guilt to drive me to my phone to call and apologize for daring to value myself. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a young woman with the whole world spread out before me like an unmapped territory waiting to be explored. Freedom. In the weeks following my confrontation with Sarah, I discovered that liberation wasn't just the absence of oppression, it was the presence of infinite possibility. For the first time in 40 years, every morning arrived like a blank canvas, waiting for me to decide how I wanted to fill it with colors of my own choosing. The silence in my house, which I'd initially feared would become unbearable, transformed into something sacred. Without the constant anxiety of waiting for Sarah's next demand or crisis, I found myself noticing sounds I'd been too distracted to hear for decades. The way rain drummed different rhythms on various parts of my roof, the morning conversations between cardinals outside my bedroom window, the gentle settling of floorboards that spoke of a house that had weathered many storms and remained standing. I began each day with a ritual that would have been impossible during my years of servitude. I sat on my back porch with coffee and my journal, writing down 3 things I wanted to do for myself that day. Not obligations or tasks designed to please others, but genuine desires that emerged from the deepest, most neglected parts of my soul. On my first Monday as a truly free woman, I wrote, "Paint the spare bedroom yellow. Call Margaret about the book club I've been meaning to join for 5 years. Buy myself flowers just because they're beautiful." The spare bedroom had been decorated in neutral beiges and grays, designed to accommodate any guest without offending anyone's taste. But I'd always loved yellow, the color of sunshine and daffodils and hope, and now there was no one to tell me it was too bold or impractical for resale value. I spent the entire day transforming that room into something that reflected my personality, rather than my compliance with other people's preferences. The walls bloomed into the warm yellow of summer mornings, and with each brush stroke, I felt layers of self-denial peeling away like old paint. This was my house, my choice, my joy. While the paint dried, I called Margaret Chen, a retired literature professor I'd met at the library years ago. She'd invited me multiple times to join her book discussion group, but I'd always declined because Sarah might need me on those Thursday evenings, or because I felt guilty spending money on books when my daughter was struggling with some manufactured financial crisis. "Merle!" Margaret's voice was warm with genuine pleasure when I explained why I was calling. "I was beginning to think you'd never have time for us mere mortals. We're reading The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo this month. Have you started it yet? I hadn't, but I drove to the bookstore that afternoon and bought not just that novel, but 3 others that had been living on my wish list for years. Standing in the poetry section, surrounded by voices that had been silenced by war and poverty and heartbreak, yet had somehow found ways to transform their pain into beauty, I felt a kinship I'd never experienced before. These were my people, the artists and dreamers and truth-tellers who understood that creating something meaningful was worth any sacrifice except the sacrifice of your authentic self. That evening, I arranged fresh sunflowers in a vase on my newly yellow windowsill and opened Evelyn Hugo to page 1. Within 20 pages, I was completely absorbed in the story of a woman who'd spent decades crafting a public image that bore no resemblance to her private truth. The parallels to my own life were uncomfortable but illuminating. I, too, had spent years performing a version of motherhood that prioritized peace over authenticity, compliance over self-respect. By the time I attended my first book club meeting the following Thursday, I felt like I was stepping into a life that had been waiting for me all along. Margaret's living room was filled with 8 women aged 55 to 78, each of them vibrant with the kind of intellectual energy that comes from minds that have remained curious despite, or perhaps because of, the challenges life had thrown at them. "Ladies," Margaret announced as I settled into the circle with my wine and notebook, "this is Merle, the friend I've been telling you about. The painter and secret reader who's finally decided to join our little band of literary rebels." The warmth of their welcome was overwhelming. These women didn't see me as someone's mother or someone's caretaker or someone's financial resource. They saw me as Merle, a person with opinions worth hearing, insights worth sharing, stories worth telling. When Dorothy, a retired nurse with silver hair and laugh lines, asked about my favorite passage from the book, I found myself speaking with confidence I hadn't felt in years about the themes of authenticity and the cost of living for other people's approval. My words seemed to resonate with the group, sparking a discussion that lasted until nearly 10 o'clock. "You have such an interesting perspective on the mother-daughter dynamics," said Frances, a former social worker whose own children lived across the country. "Have you given much thought to writing? You express yourself so beautifully." Writing. The word lodged in my chest like a seed that had been waiting for the right soil and sunshine to sprout. I'd written constantly in college. Essays and short stories and terrible poems that had felt important at the time. But marriage and motherhood had gradually crowded out the quiet spaces where creativity grows, until I'd convinced myself that such pursuits were selfish luxuries I couldn't afford. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and began writing about what it felt like to rediscover yourself at 68. The words poured out of me like water from a broken dam, decades of suppressed thoughts and feelings finally finding expression in paragraphs that captured truths I'd never allowed myself to acknowledge. I wrote about the day I realized I'd been living someone else's life, about the moment I understood that love without respect is just elaborate servitude, about the terror and exhilaration of choosing yourself when everyone expects you to remain invisible. When I finally looked up, the sun was rising, and I'd filled 14 pages with my authentic voice. Not the careful, diplomatic tone I'd used to avoid conflict with Sarah, but the raw, honest expression of a woman who'd finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in her own life. Over the following weeks, my world expanded in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community college, where I met other women who'd decided that age was no barrier to learning new skills. I joined a hiking group for seniors, discovering that my body was still capable of carrying me up mountains and through forests that fed my soul in ways I'd neglected for decades. Most surprisingly, I began volunteering at a women's shelter downtown, helping other women who were fleeing situations where their needs had been systematically ignored or suppressed. The work was heartbreaking and healing simultaneously. I could offer these women the kind of unconditional support I'd wasted on someone who'd never appreciated it, while they reminded me that survival and reinvention were always possible, no matter how hopeless circumstances appeared. "You have such a calming presence," said Maria, a 32-year-old mother of 2 who was rebuilding her life after leaving an abusive marriage. "You listen like you really understand what it's like to feel invisible." I did understand. The details were different, but the underlying dynamics were remarkably similar. The gradual erosion of self-worth, the learned helplessness that comes from having your needs consistently dismissed, the way love can become a weapon when it's conditional on your continued compliance with someone else's vision of who you should be. My work at the shelter gave me perspective on my relationship with Sarah that therapy might have provided if I'd ever been able to afford it. I began to see our dynamic not as evidence of my failure as a mother, but as the predictable result of a system where one person's needs were always prioritized over another's humanity. The most profound change came 6 weeks after our confrontation, when I was pruning roses in my garden and realized I hadn't checked my phone in over 4 hours. During my years of Sarah management, 4 hours without communication would have triggered panic attacks about what crisis might be developing in my absence. Now, the silence felt like a gift. My phone did contain one message when I finally looked. Not from Sarah, but from Emma, the young woman who'd called to validate my experience weeks earlier. "Grandma Merle, I hope you're doing well. I'm going to be in town next weekend visiting my mom, and I wondered if you might have time for coffee. I'd love to hear about what you've been up to. No pressure if you're busy. I know you're probably living your best life these days." The message made me smile in a way I hadn't in years. Here was someone who sought my company for its own sake, who valued my presence rather than my services, who understood that friendship was about mutual enjoyment rather than one-sided utility. I replied immediately, "I would love that. Saturday afternoon at that little cafe downtown? I have so much to tell you." That evening I stood in my yellow spare bedroom, now officially my art studio, surrounded by canvases depicting the world as I saw it, rather than as others expected me to see it. Paintings of storms and sunrises, of women's faces reflecting strength and sorrow and joy, of landscapes that spoke to the parts of me that had been dormant for decades. In the corner stood an easel holding my latest work, a self-portrait I'd been laboring over for 2 weeks. The woman in the painting looked directly at the viewer with eyes that held wisdom earned through suffering but not broken by it. Her silver hair caught light like spun moonbeams. Her expression was serene but not submissive, confident but not harsh. She looked like someone worth knowing, worth respecting, worth loving. She looked like me, not the diminished version I'd become while trying to earn affection through service, but the authentic woman who'd always existed beneath the performance of perfect motherhood. For the first time in 40 years, I was excited about tomorrow, about next week, about the future that stretched ahead of me like an uncharted territory full of possibilities I was finally brave enough to explore. The woman who'd been told to stay out of the kitchen had built herself an entire world where she was not just welcome, but essential, not because of what she could provide for others, but because of who she was when she stopped trying to be anyone else. At 68, I was finally ready to live the life I'd been postponing until everyone else's needs were met. The wait was over. 6 months after the day Sarah told me to stay out of my own kitchen, I received an invitation that would have been unimaginable during my years of servitude. The local community center wanted to feature my paintings in their monthly artist showcase. The woman who'd spent decades believing her only value lay in making other people's lives easier was being recognized for creating something beautiful entirely her own. I stood in my art studio, the yellow room that had become my sanctuary, reading the invitation letter for the 3rd time, still hardly able to believe the words were real. 12 of my watercolors would be displayed for an entire month, with an opening reception where I would be the guest of honor, where people would come specifically to see my work and hear my story. The old me would have immediately thought about calling Sarah to share the news, hoping for validation that never came, setting myself up for disappointment when her response inevitably centered on how this achievement might benefit her, or, more likely, how my newfound independence was somehow inconvenient for her carefully constructed world. The new me called Emma instead. "Grandma Merle, that's incredible." Emma's voice bubbled with genuine excitement across the phone line. "I am so proud of you. Can I bring my mom to the opening? She's been following your transformation story, and she says you're inspiring her to make some changes in her own life." The idea that my journey toward self-respect might inspire other women to examine their own relationships filled me with a warmth that no amount of reluctant approval from Sarah had ever provided. This was what healthy love looked like. People celebrating your achievements without calculating how those achievements might serve their own purposes. The weeks leading up to the art show passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. I selected my strongest pieces, each one telling a chapter of my story. The dark, constrained paintings from my early days of freedom, when anger and grief had dominated my palette, the gradually brightening canvases that marked my growing confidence, and finally, the vibrant, joyful works that captured my current state of contentment and possibility. The centerpiece would be my self-portrait, the painting of a woman who looked like she belonged in her own life, who took up space without apology, who had learned the difference between loving someone and disappearing for their convenience. 2 days before the opening, Margaret from the book club stopped by to see the paintings before they were transported to the gallery. She moved through my studio slowly, spending long minutes studying each piece with the kind of attention I'd craved from Sarah for decades, but had never received. "Merle," she said finally, turning to face me with tears in her eyes. "These aren't just paintings. They're a manifesto. They're proof that it's never too late to save your own life." That evening, as I was carefully wrapping each canvas for transport, my phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, my heart clenched with the old familiar longing. Despite everything that had happened, despite the peace I'd found in her absence, part of me still hoped that she might have learned to see me as more than a resource to be exploited. I let it ring twice before answering, steeling myself for whatever manipulation or crisis had prompted her to break months of silence. "Mom." Her voice was different, smaller somehow, less certain than the commanding tone I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "I heard about your art show. Emma told me." I waited, refusing to fill the silence with the apologetic babbling that had once characterized my responses to her contact. "I wanted to," she started, then stopped. "I've been thinking about some things you said, about how I treated you, about what I expected from you." Still, I said nothing. 40 years of premature forgiveness had taught me that people don't change because you make it easy for them to avoid consequences. They change when maintaining their old patterns becomes more painful than doing the work of growth. "I know I don't have the right to ask this," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I was wondering if I could come to your opening, not to make demands or to try to fix things between us, just to see what you've created, to see who you are when you're not taking care of everyone else." The request surprised me. This wasn't the Sarah I knew, the woman who attended events only when they served her purposes, who showed interest in my activities only when they somehow reflected on her own image or advancement. "Why?" I asked simply. A long pause. "Because I'm starting to understand that I never really knew you at all. I knew the version of you that existed to make my life easier, but I never bothered to discover who you were underneath all that service. And now I'm afraid I waited too long." Something in her tone suggested genuine remorse rather than strategic manipulation. But I'd learned to trust my instincts rather than my hopes where Sarah was concerned. "You can come," I said finally, "but I want you to understand something first. This isn't about us reconciling. This isn't about going back to the way things were. If you come as someone who's curious about my work, not as someone who expects to be the center of attention." "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you." The night of the opening arrived with the crisp air of early autumn, the kind of evening that feels pregnant with possibility. I dressed carefully in a flowing purple dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion, not because it was practical or because it would please anyone else, but because it made me feel like the artist I'd always been beneath the layers of self-sacrifice. The community center's gallery space had been transformed into something magical. My paintings hung under soft spotlights, each one surrounded by enough space to breathe and be appreciated. A small placard next to the entrance read, "Finding Myself at 68, The Journey of Merle Hadley." People began arriving at 6 o'clock. Members of my book club, fellow volunteers from the women's shelter, hiking companions, neighbors who'd watched my transformation with interest and admiration. Each person who approached me spoke about how my paintings made them feel, what stories they saw in the brushstrokes, how my journey resonated with their own struggles to maintain authentic selfhood in a world that often demanded performance over truth. At 7:15, I spotted Sarah near the entrance, standing uncertainly as if she wasn't sure she belonged in this space I'd created. She was dressed more casually than usual, jeans and a simple sweater that made her look younger, more vulnerable than the polished executive I'd grown accustomed to. I watched her move through the gallery, stopping at each painting with an attention I'd never seen her give to anything that didn't directly serve her interests. When she reached my self-portrait, she stood motionless for so long that other visitors began to notice. Eventually, she made her way to where I stood near the refreshment table, surrounded by admirers who were discussing the technical aspects of watercolor technique and the emotional impact of authentic artistic expression. "Mom," she said when there was a break in conversation, "could I talk to you privately for a moment?" We stepped outside onto the center's small patio, where the autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. For a few minutes we stood in silence, two women who shared DNA and 40 years of complicated history, but who were essentially strangers to each other. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said finally, her voice thick with emotion I'd rarely heard from her. "Looking at your paintings tonight, seeing how people respond to you, how they listen to you, how they see you as this complete, fascinating person, I realized that I never gave you the chance to be that person with me." She was crying now, tears that seemed to surprise her as much as they surprised me. "I turned you into my personal assistant, my backup plan, my emotional dumping ground. I took everything you offered and convinced myself I deserved it because you were my mother, because that's what mothers do. But watching you tonight, seeing how vibrant and confident and alive you are when you're not busy managing my life, I understand now that I didn't just take advantage of you. I robbed both of us of the relationship we could have had." I felt my own tears starting. Not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. This was the daughter I'd always hoped existed underneath the entitled facade. The woman capable of growth, of self-reflection, of acknowledging harm without immediately trying to minimize it. "I can't undo 40 years of selfishness," Sarah continued. "And I know I don't have the right to expect forgiveness just because I finally figured out what I was doing wrong. But I want you to know that I see you now, really see you, and I'm so sorry it took me this long." We stood together in the cool evening air, mother and daughter, two women learning how to be human with each other for the first time in decades. "Sarah," I said gently, "I forgive you, but more importantly, I forgive myself for teaching you that my needs didn't matter. We both have to do better going forward." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand in a gesture that reminded me of the little girl she'd once been. "Would you," she started hesitantly, "would you be willing to start over? Not go back to the way things were, but build something new, something where we both get to be whole people?" I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw someone who was finally ready to do the work of loving rather than just being loved. "I'd like that," I said, "but it means you'll have to get to know the real me, not just the version that existed to serve you. Are you prepared for that?" She smiled through her tears. I can't wait to meet her. 6 months later, as I write this story in my yellow studio surrounded by paintings that tell the truth about what it means to reclaim your life, I can say that Sarah and I are building something new together. It's not perfect. We're both learning how to navigate a relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. But it's real in a way our old dynamic never was. More importantly, I've learned that the most radical thing a woman can do is refuse to disappear for other people's comfort. When you stop making yourself small to avoid conflict, when you stop apologizing for taking up space, when you stop buying love with service, you discover that the people who truly belong in your life will love you more fully, not less. I am 68 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I am living entirely for myself, not in a selfish way, but in a way that honors the woman I was always meant to be underneath all the performance and people-pleasing. The woman who was told to stay out of the kitchen has learned that she was never the problem. The problem was a world that taught her to believe her worth was measured by her usefulness to others. Now I know better. Now I know that love without respect is just elaborate exploitation. Now I know that it's never too late to save your own life. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever given so much of yourself that you forgot who you were underneath all that service? Tell me in the comments. Your story matters, and you deserve to be seen. If this story resonated with you, Please like and subscribe. Someone else needs to hear this message, and together we can remind them that they're worthy of love that doesn't require them to disappear.